Imagine a city that, by every ordinary measure, should never have existed at all. No rich farmland stretching to the horizon. No mines bleeding silver from the hills. No forests close enough to draw timber without enormous effort. No great army standing ready to defend its borders. A city founded not on solid earth but on mud, marsh, and salt water on a desolate stretch of coast where the tides shifted without warning, where winds cut across the flats with nothing to stop them, and where the ground itself seemed too restless and too unreliable to hold anything permanent. By all reasonable calculation, such a place should have remained a scattering of fishing huts, a temporary shelter at best, and then dissolved back into the sea from which it half emerged. And yet, across the span of 1,000 years, this improbable settlement became one of the richest, most resilient, and most admired states in the world. It became the gateway between East and West, a republic of merchants that grew into a maritime empire whose influence stretched from the cold waters of the northern Adriatic to the perfumed bazaars of the Levant. This is the story of Venice, and like all the best stories, it begins not with triumph, but with terror. The 5th century after Christ was a time of unravelling. The Western Roman Empire, which had once imposed its will from the shores of Britain to the burning sands of North Africa, was cracking under pressure from every direction at once. Roads still ran across the land. Cities still stood. The villas of the wealthy still glittered in the afternoon sun. But the confidence that had sustained Roman civilization for centuries was draining away like water through broken stone. Northern Italy, prosperous and deeply tied to the Roman world, found itself suddenly exposed, its defences thinning, its certainties collapsing, its people watching the horizon with growing dread. Then came the shock that made the danger impossible to ignore any longer. From the steppes of the east rode the Huns, a force so swift and so destructive that whole communities dissolved before them. Led in legend and in nightmare by Attila, a name that became shorthand for the end of the world, their advance sent waves of panic rolling through the region. Fields were abandoned. Towns were emptied overnight. The Roman population of the northeast, the people known as the Veneti, did what terrified human beings have done in every age when the world catches fire around them. They ran. They did not run toward a mountain fortress or a walled stronghold. They ran toward the one landscape that a mounted army could not easily follow, the broad, bewildering lagoon stretching along the northern Adriatic coast. Cavalry that could thunder across the plains of Italy became nearly useless in that maze of mud flats. Salt marshes, hidden channels, and shallow water that shifted with every tide. The lagoon was not a paradise. It was not beautiful in any conventional sense. It smelled of salt and rotting reed and wet earth. It was exposed, uncomfortable, and desperately poor in the resources that the ancient world valued most. But it offered something worth infinitely more than comfort. In that particular moment it was difficult to reach and even more difficult to cross without intimate local knowledge. So the first Venetians were not conquerors. They were not visionaries who looked at that desolate stretch of water and foresaw magnificence. They were refugees, people who had lost their homes, their possessions, and the ordinary shape of life they had always known. They were farmers and fishermen and salt workers, families who had escaped with whatever they could carry and found themselves forced to begin again in a place that seemed barely capable of sustaining human life. There is a particular kind of quiet irony in that beginning. One of Europe's greatest powers started as an act of pure desperation. Those early communities had no luxury of romance and no time for grand visions. They simply had to survive. They learned how to live with brackish water, with unpredictable tides, with storms that arrived without warning, with the isolation of an island world that kept the mainland tantalizingly close yet practically distant. Their settlements rose on small islands and muddy banks, and everything about daily life had to be rebuilt from the ground up around the demands of the lagoon. There would be no wagon roads, no pack animals moving goods from one quarter to another. No cavalry patrols protecting a territorial border. Water defined movement, work, and time. Boats were not luxuries or accessories in such a world. They were as essential as breath. A family without a boat in early Venice was a family without legs. And beyond mere transportation, the lagoon itself began to yield resources that those early settlers had not initially sought. Salt, harvested from the shallow coastal flats, turned out to be one of the most strategically valuable substances in the early medieval world. It preserved meat and fish through the long months when fresh food was unavailable. It could be traded across considerable distances with communities that had no access to the sea, even before Venice had any thought of long-distance commerce. It was already learning one of the foundational lessons of its future greatness, that wealth could be drawn directly from the water. If you understood how to read what the water was offering you, yet none of this survival would have amounted to anything permanent without one of the most remarkable feats of practical engineering in the entire medieval period. The great and merciless question facing those early builders was deceptively simple. How do you construct anything lasting in mud? How do you raise houses, churches, warehouses, and wharves when the ground beneath your feet is soft, saturated, and eager to swallow weight? The answer the Venetians devised was both ingenious and almost absurdly labour-intensive. They drove long, sharpened wooden piles, hundreds of thousands of them, eventually millions deep down through the unstable upper layers of the lagoon bed, forcing them through until they reached the hard-packed clay that lay far beneath. These piles, submerged permanently in the oxygen-poor mud, did not rot the way wood does in open air. They petrified over time, hardening almost to the consistency of stone. On top of this invisible forest of timber, builders laid thick wooden platforms. On top of those platforms, they placed stone foundations, and only then, balanced atop this vast, hidden, underwater armature, did the actual buildings of Venice begin to rise. The beauty that would one day astonish visitors from across the world, the marble facades, the soaring campaniles, the Gothic arches reflected in green water, rested on a foundation that no visitor ever saw and almost no one thought about. Venice was, in the most literal sense, built on an upside-down forest. Its magnificence was, from the very beginning, the product not of natural advantage, but of relentless, unglamorous, practical problem-solving, repeated endlessly until the impossible became functional. That habit of mind, that instinct for finding a workable solution rather than waiting for ideal conditions, would remain the deepest characteristic of Venetian civilization, long after the mud and the piles were forgotten beneath centuries of marble and gold. Those early decades in the lagoon also did something less visible but equally important. They began to reshape the character of the people living there. Geography does not merely determine what a city looks like, it determines how its people think. The lagoon taught lessons every single day, and those lessons accumulated across generations into a distinctive way of engaging with the world. Living in a place where the ground could not be entirely trusted taught the Venetians to value adaptability over rigidity. Living in a place where survival depended on reading hidden channels and shifting sandbars taught them to be observant, cautious, and slow to take anything at face value. Living in a place where feudal landholding was essentially impossible, where no mounted aristocrat could dominate marshland, the way noble families dominated the broad inland plains, pushed the community away from the hierarchies of blood towards something closer to a hierarchy of skill and practical competence. The lagoon did not naturally produce castle lords or knights or great agricultural estates. It produced boatmen, pilots, fishermen, salt workers, and traders, people whose status depended less on what they owned and more on what they could do. That distinction, quiet as it was in those earliest centuries, helps explain why Venice would eventually develop so differently from the rest of medieval Europe. The people of the lagoon were already, without quite knowing it, training themselves for a different kind of civilization, one that would measure power not in acres of land but in the reach of a ship's hull, the reliability of a contract, and the depth of a merchant's knowledge of distant markets. The city born from panic and salt water was not destined to remain a humble refuge forever. The same lagoon that had sheltered those first terrified refugees was already quietly transforming them into something the world had not yet seen. There is a particular kind of strength that only hardship can produce, not the strength of armies or the strength of inherited wealth, but the quieter, more durable strength of people who have learned to solve problems that should not have solutions. The early Venetians had that strength in abundance, and they needed every bit of it. Surviving in the lagoon demanded far more than physical courage. It demanded a constant, restless ingenuity applied to challenges that arrived every single day without pause. The mud that swallowed foundations, the tides that flooded lower islands without warning, the brackish water that could not be drunk, the storms that swept in from the Adriatic and dismantled in a single night what had taken months to construct. Each of these was not merely an inconvenience. Each was a potentially lethal obstacle for a community that had no great reserves of wealth, no outside army to call upon, and no established infrastructure to fall back on. What the early settlers had instead was each other, and the accumulated knowledge that came from paying very close attention to the environment that surrounded them. They studied the lagoon the way a scholar studies a difficult text carefully, repeatedly, and with the understanding that a misreading could be fatal. They learned which channels were navigable at low tide and which became deadly shallows. They learned how to read the colour of the water and the movement of the birds and the direction of the wind to anticipate what the lagoon intended to do next. This intimate, hard-won knowledge of their environment became one of the earliest and most important competitive advantages the Venetian people would ever possess. Long before they had merchant fleets or political institutions or sacred relics to their name, they had something rarer, a profound understanding of the world they actually lived in, rather than the world they might have wished for. The most immediate and practical expression of that ingenuity was the solution they developed for the fundamental problem of construction. Building anything permanent in the lagoon required confronting the fact that the ground beneath was not ground in any conventional sense. It was a deep, unstable mixture of sand, silt, clay, and water material that shifted and compressed and resisted the weight of stone with a kind of passive, indifferent hostility. The solution the Venetians arrived at was extraordinary in its conception and almost incomprehensible in the sheer scale of its execution. They drove wooden piles long, sharpened trunks of alder and oak and larch, species chosen specifically for their density and their resistance to decay deep into the lagoon bed. Not dozens of piles, not hundreds, but eventually hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions. Across the full extent of the growing city, these piles were driven through the soft upper layers of mud and sand until their tips reached the compressed clay that lay beneath, a stable substrate that could bear real weight, submerged permanently in the cold, oxygen-poor environment of the lagoon floor, sealed away from the air that would have caused them to rot. These timbers did not decay in the ordinary sense. Over the course of decades and centuries, the constant pressure and the mineral-rich water slowly petrified them, transforming wood into something approaching stone. On top of this invisible armature, this vast, buried, upside-down forest that no visitor would ever see, the builders laid horizontal platforms of thick timber. On top of those platforms, they placed the stone and brick foundations of the actual buildings. The result was a city that appeared, from any reasonable vantage point, to sit directly on the water, conjured there by some act of collective imagination. The reality beneath that appearance was an almost incomprehensible labour of timber, mud, patience, and engineering genius repeated across every quarter of the lagoon over the course of many generations. When later visitors marvelled at the weightless beauty of Venetian palaces rising from the water's surface, they were seeing only the final chapter of a story whose earlier chapters were written in darkness and mud, by workers whose names were never recorded and whose effort made everything else possible. Salt was the other great foundation of early Venetian life, and its importance cannot be overstated in a world that had no refrigeration and no reliable method of preserving food through the long winter months beyond drying and salting. The lagoon's shallow coastal flats were ideal for salt production. Seawater could be channeled into broad, shallow pans and left to evaporate under the sun, leaving behind the white crystals that were, in the early medieval economy, nearly as valuable by weight as silver. The Venetians understood this early and exploited it systematically. Salt gave them their first real commodity, something they could produce in quantity and trade with the mainland communities that could not easily produce it themselves. Grain, timber, livestock, and manufactured goods flowed into the lagoon from inland Italy in exchange for salt that flowed outward from the lagoon's edges. This early trade was modest by the standards of what Venice would later become, but it was foundational in a deeper sense. It established the basic pattern that would define Venetian civilization for 1,000 years, the pattern of possessing something others needed, controlling access to it, and converting that control into profit and influence. Salt taught Venice how to think like a trader before Venice had any real merchants to speak of. It established the habit of looking at the natural world not merely as a backdrop for survival, but as a source of exchangeable value. That habit of mind, once formed, proved remarkably transferable. When the opportunities of long-distance Mediterranean trade eventually presented themselves, the people of the lagoon were already psychologically prepared to seize them, because they had spent generations learning how to extract value from what they had, rather than mourning what they lacked. What the lagoon produced in those early centuries was therefore something more significant than a city. It produced a particular kind of human being, the Venetian character observant, practical, adaptable, outward-looking, commercially minded, and deeply suspicious of anything that smelled of unchecked individual ambition, was not an accident of temperament or an inheritance from some distant cultural tradition. It was a direct product of the environment in which the community had been forged. A place where the ground could not be trusted taught people not to trust appearances. A place where survival depended on cooperative labour, on the shared effort of driving piles and managing channels and organising salt harvests, taught people the value of institutions over personalities. A place where feudal landholding was essentially impossible, where no cavalry lord could dominate Saltmarsh the way he might dominate a broad agricultural plain, pushed society away from hierarchy based on birth and towards something closer to hierarchy based on demonstrated competence and accumulated wealth through trade. The lagoon did not produce knights. It did not produce castle lords or serfs or the elaborate pyramid of obligation that structured life across most of medieval Europe. It produced pilots and boatmen and salt merchants and, in time, the shrewdest commercial minds on the continent. These were people who had never had the luxury of assuming that the world owed them anything, because the world they lived in had made that assumption impossible from the very beginning. And perhaps that is the most important thing to understand about Venice before anything else than its later magnificence. The golden mosaics and the marble palaces and the merchant fleets that crossed every sea was not a departure from its origins, but a direct continuation of them. The city that would one day negotiate with emperors and command crusades began as a community of refugees who had learned, through absolute necessity, that intelligence and adaptability and willingness to work with what you actually had were worth more than any inheritance of land or blood. The lagoon had given them nothing easy. In return, they had built something the world had never quite seen before. There is a question that sits at the heart of every refugee community that manages to survive its initial crisis. What comes next? Survival is one thing. Building something that lasts, something with structure, justice, and the capacity to hold together under pressure is an entirely different challenge, and in many ways a harder one. The early Venetians had answered the first question with remarkable ingenuity. They had driven their piles into the mud, harvested their salt, learned the language of the lagoon, and built a community where none should have existed. But as the decades accumulated and the settlements grew more permanent, A second and more complex question began to press upon them. How do you govern a community of people who fled precisely because they had been governed badly? How do you create order without recreating the tyranny that drove your ancestors into the marshes in the first place? The people of the Lagoon had watched the mainland of Italy dissolve into a patchwork of warlords, feudal strongmen, and petty rulers who measured their authority by the number of men they could put in the field and the extent of land they could dominate by force. That model of power was exactly what the Venetians had escaped. The memory of it, the instability, the violence. The way a single ambitious man could overturn the lives of thousands shaped everything about the political system they eventually constructed. They did not build a government designed to project power. They built a government designed to contain it. The solution they arrived at was, by the standards of medieval Europe, almost shockingly original. At its centre stood the figure of the Doge, a title derived from the Latin word meaning leader, an office established in the 8th century when the scattered lagoon communities concluded that they needed a single representative figure, capable of speaking for them in dealings with foreign powers and coordinating their internal affairs. But the Venetians were deeply, almost obsessively cautious about what kind of leader they were creating. The Doge was not a king. He was not a hereditary ruler whose son would inherit his position and whose family would accumulate dynastic power across generations. He was an elected official, chosen by the leading families of the city, and he served for life, but his authority was hedged, limited, and monitored at every turn by a web of institutions specifically designed to prevent any individual from gaining too much influence. When a new Doge took office, he was required to swear an elaborate oath known as the Promissione Ducale, a document that listed in precise and unsparing detail exactly what he was and was not permitted to do. He could not appoint his own successor. He could not allow his sons to hold significant public offices during his own tenure. He could not leave the city without formal permission from the councils that surrounded him. His personal correspondence was opened and reviewed by state officials before it reached his hands. Gifts from foreign rulers required official approval. Even his movements within the city were governed by protocol and observation. To a modern reader, these restrictions might seem almost comic in their thoroughness, the portrait of a powerful man rendered ceremonially impotent. But to the Venetians, every single one of those restrictions was a hard-won lesson drawn from the history of what happened when powerful men were trusted too completely. At the centre of the Republic's actual governing machinery stood the Great Council, the Maggior Consiglio, composed of members drawn from the noble merchant families whose fortunes and identities were tied to Venetian commerce. These were not landowners in the feudal sense. Their wealth did not come from serfs working broad agricultural estates while the lord hunted and fought. Their wealth came from ships and cargo and contracts and the intricate, long-distance networks of exchange that connected Venice to the markets of Byzantium, the Levant, and eventually the whole of the Mediterranean world. This commercial origin shaped their political instincts profoundly. A merchant who has spent his life calculating risk understands better than most the danger of placing too many resources in the hands of a single decision-maker. The great merchant families of Venice applied that same logic to governance. The Great Council elected the officials who ran every institution of the Republic. It controlled legislation and administration. It was the ultimate source of political authority, and its membership formalized and restricted in the famous closure known as the Serrata of 1297, which limited council membership to established noble families, gave the system a remarkable continuity across generations. Power in Venice did not swing violently between competing dynasties the way it did in the kingdoms of France or England or the Holy Roman Empire. It circulated, slowly and deliberately, through a structure of councils, committees, and elected offices that was deliberately designed to prevent sudden upheaval. Decisions took time. Consensus mattered. No single voice could overwhelm the system. Because the system had been built specifically to resist that possibility, perhaps the most feared institution within this elaborate structure was the Council of Ten, established in the early 14th century as a special body charged with protecting the Republic from internal threats. Its mandate was simple, and its methods were not always gentle. It existed to detect conspiracies, punish treason, and ensure that no individual or faction could undermine the stability of the state. It operated with a secrecy that made ordinary citizens nervous and foreign observers deeply uneasy. It could summon, investigate, and punish without the lengthy deliberative processes that governed other institutions. Its mere existence served as a reminder that loyalty to the Republic was not merely an expectation, but a requirement that the state took seriously enough to enforce. Complementing the Council of Ten was one of the most visually striking expressions of civic surveillance in the medieval world, the Bocche di Leone, the lion's mouth letterboxes carved into stone walls across the city. These stone faces, mouths open in permanent readiness, invited citizens to slip anonymous written accusations inside, reporting suspected corruption, treason, or misconduct by officials or neighbours. The accusations were then reviewed and, if deemed credible, could trigger formal investigations. The system was not without its abuses. Anonymous denunciation is a tool that frightened and vindictive people can easily misuse, but it reflected something genuine about the Venetian approach to governance. The Republic did not rely solely on official inspectors to monitor itself. It enlisted the entire population in the project of maintaining the integrity of the state. Trust was extended carefully and verified constantly. While this created an atmosphere that could shade toward the uncomfortable, it also produced something rare and genuinely valuable, a government that, for all its complexity and occasional harshness, remained remarkably free from the catastrophic corruption and political breakdown that destroyed so many of its contemporaries. Venice did not experience the coups, the civil wars, the dynastic collapses, or the sudden reversals of fortune that periodically devastated other medieval states. Its system was slow, cautious, and deliberately complicated, but it worked, year after year, decade after decade, century after century. The machinery of the Venetian Republic turned electing officials, debating policy, managing trade, defending borders with a continuity that its rivals could only observe with a mixture of admiration and bewilderment. The refugees who had once huddled in the marshes to escape the violence of powerful men had built, over the course of several generations, one of the most stable and enduring political systems in the history of the Western world. They had answered the hardest question a community can face, not merely how to survive, but how to remain free while doing so. Power in the medieval world was never purely a matter of armies and gold. There was a third currency, less tangible than silver and less visible than warships, but in many ways more potent than either, and that currency was sacred authority. Cities competed for it as fiercely as they competed for trade routes. They spent fortunes acquiring it, built their greatest monuments to house it, and organized their public identities around it. A city that possessed the remains of a great saint was not merely a political center or a commercial hub. It became a destination, a place charged with divine proximity, drawing pilgrims and prestige and the kind of spiritual legitimacy that no amount of merchant wealth could simply purchase outright. Rome had the tombs of the apostles Peter and Paul, foundations so sacred that the entire Western Church organized itself around them. Constantinople had accumulated over centuries a treasury of holy relics so vast and so varied that it read like a catalogue of the entire Christian past, fragments of the true cross, the crown of thorns, the remains of prophets and martyrs gathered from every corner of the known world. Against these accumulations, Venice had almost nothing. Its patron saint at the time was Theodore, a perfectly respectable military martyr, but a relatively minor figure in the wider Christian imagination, and one whose cult was closely associated with Byzantium. For a city that was increasingly moving toward independence from the Byzantine world, that association was not merely inadequate, it was quietly embarrassing. The leaders of Venice understood the problem with clarity. If the Republic intended to stand among the great powers of the Mediterranean, it needed a patron whose name carried genuine weight across the whole of Christendom. Their solution was breathtaking in its ambition and audacious in its execution. They decided that Venice should have the body of St. Mark the Evangelist, not a minor martyr, not a local holy figure whose significance faded beyond a particular region. Mark was one of the four authors of the Gospels, one of the foundational voices of Christian scripture, a figure whose written words had been read aloud in churches across the known world for 8 centuries. His remains were preserved in Alexandria, in Egypt, where they had rested in a shrine that attracted pilgrims from across the eastern Mediterranean. The problem was obvious and considerable. Alexandria was under the rule of a Muslim caliphate. Requesting the relic through official channels would almost certainly produce a refusal. Attempting to seize it by force was completely out of the question for a city that operated in those waters through trade and diplomacy rather than military conquest. The only viable option was something between clever negotiation and outright theft, executed with enough plausible deniability to survive the telling afterward. In the year 828, 2 Venetian merchants named Buono da Malamocco and Rustico da Torcello set out for Alexandria on what appeared, to any outside observer, to be an ordinary commercial visit. Both men were experienced traders who knew the city, its customs, its rhythms, and its people. They understood the ports of the eastern Mediterranean the way a musician understands an instrument, not theoretically, but practically, from long years of use. That practical knowledge was precisely what the mission required. When they arrived in Alexandria, they made contact with the Christian custodians of the shrine where Mark's remains were kept, and they presented those custodians with an argument that mixed genuine religious concern with considerable psychological pressure. The relic, they suggested, was in danger. Under Muslim rule, the saint's body might eventually be subject to desecration or destruction. Venice, by contrast, was a devoted Christian city, capable of honouring the saint properly and protecting his remains for eternity. Whether the custodians were genuinely persuaded by this argument, or whether a more material form of persuasion also changed hands, is something the historical record declines to specify with precision. What is clear is that the Venetians eventually succeeded in gaining possession of the remains. Getting the relic out of Egypt proved almost as challenging as acquiring it. Ships leaving Alexandria were subject to inspection by Muslim customs officials, and cargo was examined carefully for prohibited goods. If the inspectors discovered that the merchants were attempting to remove the body of a revered Christian saint, the consequences would have been severe and the mission would have ended in disaster. The Venetians responded to this challenge with a solution that has become one of the most frequently retold stories in the entire history of the city. A story so perfectly constructed that it sounds almost too good to be true, yet whose essential outline has been repeated consistently enough across the sources to suggest a foundation in real events. They placed the saint's body inside a large basket and covered it with layers of pork and cabbage leaves. The reasoning was straightforward and based on accurate cultural knowledge. Pork was considered ritually impure within Islamic law, and contact with it was avoided as a matter of religious observance. When the customs officials arrived to inspect the cargo, they lifted the covering and found themselves looking at a basket filled with pork. Rather than reach into the contents and examine what lay beneath, they pulled back in disgust and waved the cargo through without further inspection. The ship carrying the body of St. Mark departed Alexandria and set its course for the Adriatic. When Buono and Rustico finally brought their extraordinary cargo into the lagoon, Venice erupted. Church bells rang across the islands. Crowds gathered along every waterfront and canal. The relic was carried through the city in a solemn procession of priests and nobles and ordinary citizens whose faces, if contemporary accounts are to be believed, showed something close to collective disbelief that this had actually worked. For Venice, the moment was genuinely transformative, not merely as a religious event, but as a statement of civic identity and political ambition made audible to the entire Christian world. The construction of a great church to house the relic began almost immediately. What eventually rose beside the Doge's palace was not a building in any familiar Western European style. St. Mark's Basilica was Byzantine in its bones and Byzantine in its soul, a structure of swelling domes and richly decorated surfaces, whose interior walls and ceilings were covered with golden mosaics that caught the candlelight, multiplied it into something that felt, to those who stood inside, less like a church and more like a sustained argument for the existence of heaven. Craftsmen trained in the traditions of Constantinople worked on its surfaces over the course of many decades, creating images of extraordinary sophistication and beauty. The basilica stood directly beside the Doge's palace, and that physical proximity was not accidental. It was a declaration. The spiritual heart of the Republic and its political centre occupied the same space, each lending authority to the other, each insisting by its mere presence that faith and governance in Venice were not separate domains, but two expressions of the same civic will. The winged lion that represented St. Mark in Christian iconography, a creature holding a book, solemn and watchful, was immediately adopted as the symbol of the Republic itself. It appeared on coins and carved above city gates and flew from the masts of Venetian ships. As Venice extended its reach across the Mediterranean in the centuries that followed, the lion travelled with it, appearing on the walls of distant ports and island fortresses as a declaration that the Republic had arrived and intended to remain. The theft of a saint had given Venice something that no amount of commercial success alone could have provided: a sacred identity, a mythological foundation, and a symbol powerful enough to carry the city's name across the entire known world. There were two places in Venice that, together, captured everything essential about the Republic's character. One was visible to every visitor who arrived by water: the glittering facade of St. Mark's Basilica, its golden mosaics catching the morning light, its domes rising above the piazza like a promise of divine favour made permanent in stone and gold leaf. The other was hidden behind high red brick walls in the eastern quarter of the city, accessible only through guarded gates, and almost never shown to foreign visitors. The contrast between these two places was not a contradiction. It was a portrait. The basilica represented what Venice wished the world to see: a city touched by sacred authority, magnificent and serene, confident in its divine protection. What lay behind those brick walls represented what actually kept the Republic alive: an industrial complex of such extraordinary efficiency and sophistication that it had no real parallel anywhere in the medieval world. This was the Arsenal of Venice, and understanding it is essential to understanding how a city of perhaps 100,000 people, built on a cluster of muddy islands with no agricultural hinterland and no mineral wealth, managed to project military and commercial power across thousands of miles of open water for the better part of 6 centuries. The arsenal was not merely a shipyard, it was the engine of empire, and the Venetians knew it well enough to guard its secrets with the same intensity that other states guarded their treasury vaults. The scale of the arsenal was, by medieval standards, almost incomprehensible. The complex enclosed an enormous area of warehouses, workshops, dry docks, rope walks, timber yards, sail lofts, and foundries, all enclosed within walls that gave the place the appearance of a fortified city within a city. Thousands of workers, the arsenalotti, as they were known, laboured there under conditions that were, by the standards of the age, remarkably privileged. They were permanent state employees rather than casual labourers hired and dismissed according to seasonal need. They received regular wages paid by the Republic, along with benefits that would have seemed extraordinary to most working people of the medieval world: pensions, in some cases housing for their families, and a social status within Venetian society that reflected the Republic's genuine understanding of how dependent it was on their skill and loyalty. In return, the arsenalotti maintained their workshops with fierce professional pride and guarded the industrial knowledge of the complex with absolute discretion. Foreign visitors to Venice were treated to elaborate ceremonies and shown magnificent churches and palaces. The arsenal's interior remained largely invisible to outside eyes, not from false modesty, but from strategic calculation. What happened within those walls gave Venice an advantage so significant that allowing rivals to study it closely would have been an act of extraordinary recklessness. What happened there was innocence, a version of industrial mass production that would not appear elsewhere in the world for several more centuries. Most shipyards of the medieval period built vessels one at a time, each ship a custom project assembled slowly by craftsmen who moved from task to task as the hull took shape over the course of many months. The arsenal operated on an entirely different principle. Different workshops produced standardized components in large quantities, oars cut to uniform lengths, rudders shaped to standard dimensions, masts prepared in advance, ropes coiled and stored in measured lengths, sails stitched to specifications that matched the vessels they were designed to serve. Each component was interchangeable, each fitting designed to work with any ship of a particular class without individual adjustment. When the Republic needed a new fleet, production could begin immediately, drawing on warehouses already stocked with the necessary parts, rather than starting each element from scratch. At the heart of the system ran a canal that served as the assembly spine of the entire operation. A partially constructed hull would be floated into this canal and moved slowly from one station to the next, each stop bringing a new team of specialists who installed the components their workshop had prepared. One group fitted the rowing benches, another mounted the mast and its rigging, another installed weapons, defensive equipment, and the various fittings that transformed a wooden hull into a functioning warship. By the time the vessel reached the far end of the canal, it was complete and ready for service. The efficiency of this system astonished anyone who witnessed it, and one of the most famous stories associated with the arsenal captures that astonishment perfectly. A visiting dignitary, shown around the complex as part of an official reception, was invited to sit down to a formal meal while the Venetians demonstrated their capabilities. By the time the meal was finished and the guests rose from the table, a fully equipped war galley had been constructed, fitted, and made ready for sea. Whether the story contains some degree of embellishment is almost beside the point. Even a substantially slower version of that process would have been remarkable by the standards of any rival power in the Mediterranean. Venice could build warships faster than any competitor, and in a world where naval superiority often depended on the ability to replace losses quickly, that speed was a strategic advantage of the First Order. During times of crisis, the Republic could expand its fleet with a rapidity that left enemies struggling to respond. During times of peace, the arsenal maintained a constant state of readiness that meant Venice was never caught entirely unprepared by a sudden deterioration in the political weather. The arsenal also illuminated something important about the Venetian approach to collective enterprise. The same disciplined, systematic thinking that had produced the Republic's elaborate political structure, its councils and committees, its checks and balances, its deliberate resistance to improvisation in matters of governance, expressed itself equally in the organization of industrial production. Venice did not leave important things to chance. Whether those things were political decisions or the manufacture of ship components, planning, standardization, and institutional memory were valued over individual brilliance precisely because institutional memory persisted while individual brilliance was mortal. Yet for all its industrial seriousness, Venice also understood that a city needs more than efficiency to hold itself together across generations. It needs ceremony, beauty, and shared ritual moments when the community steps back from the daily work of survival and commerce and reminds itself of who it is and what it values. The most extraordinary of these rituals was the annual ceremony known as the Marriage to the Sea, the Sposalizio del Mar, held each year on the Feast of the Ascension. On that morning, the Doge and the highest officials of the Republic gathered in elaborate ceremonial dress and boarded the Bucintoro, a vessel so magnificent, so encrusted with golden carving and rich fabric and sculptural decoration, that it looked less like a ship than like a floating palace dreamed into existence by an architect who had never been asked to consider practical constraints. The Bucintoro glided out onto the lagoon, surrounded by hundreds of smaller boats, gondolas, merchant vessels, decorated barges forming a grand procession that moved slowly toward the open water where the calm interior of the lagoon met the broader Adriatic Sea. There the procession halted. The Doge stepped forward, raised a golden ring above his head so that all present could see it clearly, and recited the words of the ceremony in Latin words that declared Venice's eternal dominion over the sea and its permanent bond with the waters that surrounded and sustained it. Then he cast the ring into the water. The gesture was simultaneously a prayer and a declaration of sovereignty, an acknowledgement of dependence and an assertion of mastery, a moment of genuine religious feeling and a carefully staged piece of political theatre. The sea had given Venice everything: protection, trade routes, food, wealth, and the geographic isolation that allowed its unique civilization to develop without being absorbed by the feudal world of the mainland. The annual ceremony reminded every citizen, and every foreign observer who happened to be present, that the Republic understood this debt completely and intended to honour it in perpetuity. Together, the arsenal and the marriage to the sea expressed the two sides of Venice that would define it for centuries: the relentlessly practical and the gloriously theatrical, the machine and the ceremony, the discipline that built empires, and the beauty that made those empires worth building. For the first several centuries of its existence, Venice lived in the long shadow of a civilization far older, far larger, and far more sophisticated than anything the lagoon settlements could yet claim to be. The Byzantine Empire, the eastern continuation of the Roman world, centered on the incomparable city of Constantinople, was in the early medieval period the most advanced state in the Christian world. Its capital sat at the junction of Europe and Asia, commanding the narrow strait that connected the Black Sea to the Mediterranean, and through that geographic accident had accumulated a concentration of wealth, culture, and accumulated human knowledge that made the cities of Western Europe look, by comparison, like ambitious villages. The golden domes of Constantinople's churches caught the light of the Bosphorus. Its markets overflowed with goods from China, India, Persia, and the Arab world. Its libraries preserved texts that the western half of the continent had long since lost. Its army and its navy, though both diminished from the heights of earlier centuries, still commanded respect across the Mediterranean. For the merchants of Venice, looking eastward from their lagoon at the edge of the Adriatic, Constantinople was not merely a distant imperial capital, it was the centre of the world's most valuable trading network, and access to it was worth almost any price. The relationship between Venice and Byzantium that developed across the 9th, 10th, and 11th centuries was consequently one of the most consequential partnerships in medieval history, a relationship that began as a straightforward arrangement between a great power and a useful subordinate, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, transformed into something far more complicated and far more dangerous for both parties involved. In its earliest form, the connection was relatively simple. Venice occupied an ambiguous position in the political geography of early medieval Italy. Technically, the lagoon communities fell within the sphere of Byzantine authority. The Eastern Empire still claimed theoretical sovereignty over portions of Italy, and the Venetians, for their part, found it convenient to shelter beneath that claim when dealing with the aggressive Lombard and Frankish powers of the mainland. But the relationship was never one of genuine subjugation. Constantinople was hundreds of miles away across mountains and open sea, preoccupied with threats far closer to home: Arab expansion in the south and east, Bulgarian pressure from the north, the constant internal turbulence of imperial court politics. In practice, the Venetians governed themselves, developed their own institutions, and pursued their own commercial interests with a degree of independence that bore little resemblance to the experience of populations under more direct imperial control. What Byzantium provided was not supervision, but legitimacy, a framework of recognized authority within which Venice could operate and develop without being constantly challenged by the mainland powers that surrounded it. What Venice provided in return was something the empire valued considerably: a capable naval ally stationed at the northern end of the Adriatic, able to project maritime power into waters that Byzantine fleets could not always reach efficiently. This mutual convenience formed the foundation of a relationship that would, at its peak, benefit both parties enormously. The moment that crystallized that benefit into something permanent and transformative came in the year 1082. During the reign of Emperor Alexios I Komnenos, Alexios was facing a serious military threat from Norman forces advancing through the Mediterranean, and he needed naval assistance quickly. The Venetian fleet was capable, available, and willing for a price. The price that Alexios agreed to pay was extraordinary in its generosity and, as later events would demonstrate, extraordinary in its long-term consequences for the empire that granted it. The document he issued, known as the Golden Bull of 1082, gave Venetian merchants the right to trade throughout the Byzantine Empire without paying the customs, duties and taxes that other merchants, including the empire's own subjects, were required to pay. In the major port cities of the empire, Venetian traders were granted entire districts of their own, complete with warehouses, docks, churches, and the legal right to conduct business under their own rules. In Constantinople itself, the most commercially active city in the Christian world, Venetian merchants received a permanent quarter along the Golden Horn and access to markets that had previously been available to them only on far less favourable terms. The immediate impact was dramatic and deeply felt. Tax-free trade gave Venetian merchants a structural cost advantage over every competitor in the Byzantine market, where a Genoese or Pisan merchant had to factor customs duties into the price of every transaction. A Venetian could offer the same goods more cheaply and still earn a greater profit. Cargo that might otherwise have been distributed among several competing trading nations flowed increasingly through Venetian hands. Ships from the Lagoon arrived in Constantinople with growing regularity, carrying goods from Western Europe and returning laden with silks, spices, precious metals, and luxury items that the markets of Italy and beyond were eager to consume. Within a generation of the Golden Bull's issuance, the Venetian community in Constantinople had grown from a modest commercial presence into a substantial and visibly prosperous colony that occupied a significant portion of the city's most valuable waterfront real estate. The problem, and it was a problem that grew steadily more serious with each passing decade, was that the arrangement worked almost too well from Venice's perspective, and not nearly well enough from Byzantium's. The empire had intended to reward a useful ally with commercial privileges that would strengthen the relationship between the two states. What it had actually done was create a situation in which enormous volumes of trade were passing through the Byzantine Empire, while generating essentially no revenue for the imperial treasury. The Venetians paid nothing at the customs houses. They occupied prime commercial real estate in the empire's greatest city. Their ships dominated the harbours. Their merchants grew visibly, almost provocatively wealthy in the midst of a population that was being taxed with increasing severity to fund the empire's military needs and administrative costs. The resentment that accumulated among ordinary Byzantine citizens and local merchants was entirely understandable and, from the Venetian perspective, entirely inconvenient. The Venetian community in Constantinople became the focus of a hostility that occasionally erupted into open violence riots in the streets. Attacks on Venetian property, clashes between local populations and the foreign traders who seemed to grow richer with every passing year, while the empire around them struggled. Imperial officials sometimes intervened to protect the Venetians, but the interventions themselves carried a note of reluctant obligation rather than genuine goodwill. The relationship between patron and client was visibly, uncomfortably reversing itself. The empire that had granted the privileges was discovering that it lacked the leverage to modify or withdraw them without triggering a diplomatic crisis with a maritime power it still needed. Venice, meanwhile, was discovering something that would shape its foreign policy for the next century, that economic dominance, properly established and defended, could translate into a form of political power that military force alone could not easily dislodge. By the closing decades of the 12th century, the alliance between Venice and Byzantium had curdled into something neither side had anticipated or desired. The privileges remained in place, but the goodwill that had once surrounded them had largely evaporated. Venetian merchants continued to dominate Byzantine trade, but they did so in an atmosphere of mutual suspicion and barely suppressed hostility that made the relationship feel less like a partnership and more like an occupation that neither party had formally acknowledged. Venice was no longer a subordinate of the Byzantine world. It was a rival operating from within the empire's own borders. And the empire was beginning to understand, with growing alarm, exactly how exposed that made it. In the final years of the 12th century, a new voice rose above the political noise of Europe, with a message that had been heard before but never quite lost its power to move people. Pope Innocent III, one of the most formidable occupants of the papal throne in the entire medieval period, proclaimed a new crusade in 1198. The holy city of Jerusalem, captured by Crusader armies a century earlier at enormous cost in blood and faith, had fallen back under Muslim control, to Innocent and to the thousands across France, Flanders, and the Holy Roman Empire who responded to his call. This was not merely a political setback, it was a spiritual wound that demanded healing, a wrong of cosmic proportions that Christian civilization was obligated to correct. Nobles gathered their knights, priests delivered sermons about salvation through holy war, young men sewed crosses onto their tunics and pledged themselves to an enterprise that promised, depending on one's degree of faith, either eternal glory or actual paradise. The enthusiasm was genuine and widespread, and it collided almost immediately with the hard, practical reality that enthusiasm alone cannot move an army across the Mediterranean Sea. Ships were needed, enormous numbers of them, transport vessels capable of carrying tens of thousands of soldiers, their horses, their equipment, and the supplies needed to sustain a major military campaign across open water and into hostile territory. There was exactly one place in the known world capable of providing such a fleet on the scale the crusade required, and every leader of the expedition understood this without needing to be told. The Crusaders needed Venice, and Venice knew it. The delegation that arrived in Venice in 1201 to negotiate the terms of the arrangement found itself facing one of the most remarkable figures of the entire medieval period. Enrico Dandolo was the Doge of Venice, and by the time the Crusader envoys stood before him, he was already, depending on which account one consults, somewhere between 85 and 97 years old. He was also completely blind, having lost his sight either through illness or through an injury sustained during his long years of diplomatic service in Constantinople, a city whose relationship with Venice, as the previous decades had demonstrated, was complex enough to be dangerous even for experienced negotiators. None of this diminished him in any perceptible way. Those who dealt with Dandolo quickly discovered that his physical limitations were a kind of camouflage, concealing a mind of extraordinary sharpness, a will of almost frightening determination, and a capacity for long-term strategic thinking that made him arguably the most dangerous negotiator in Europe. When the Crusader envoys presented their request, a fleet large enough to transport a major army to the eastern Mediterranean, Dandolo listened carefully, asked precise questions, and understood immediately and completely what was actually being offered. Not merely a commercial contract, though it was certainly that, an opportunity of a kind that came perhaps once in a generation, if that, the full resources of a crusading army, desperate for maritime transport, and therefore willing to accept terms that a less urgent situation would never have produced. Placed directly in the hands of the Republic, Dandolo brought the proposal to the Great Council and then, in an extraordinary scene, to the full assembly of the Venetian people gathered in St. Mark's Basilica, thousands of citizens packed into the golden interior of the church, listening as the terms were explained and then erupting in unanimous approval. The contract was agreed, Venice would build and supply a fleet capable of transporting approximately 33,000 men and 4,500 horses, along with all necessary provisions for 9 months of campaigning. The price was 85,000 silver marks, one of the largest single financial agreements in the history of the Middle Ages, plus half of all territories and plunder captured during the expedition. The arsenal immediately began its work. For the better part of a year, the arsenal operated at a level of intensity that even its considerable reputation had not previously been tested to match. Timber was hauled into the shipyards in quantities that stripped the surrounding region of available wood. Workers laboured through long days and short nights constructing transport vessels, warships, and the specialised equipment needed to move an army across the sea. Normal commercial shipping from Venice was suspended or dramatically reduced, as the Republic redirected its entire maritime capacity toward fulfilling the contract. The city had, in effect, bet itself on the Crusade's success, invested its industrial capacity, its labour, its commercial revenue, and its political credibility in an enterprise whose outcome no one could yet know. When the summer of 1202 arrived and Crusader forces began appearing in Venice to embark, the fleet that waited for them in the Lagoon was extraordinary. Hundreds of vessels of various types, assembled with the characteristic Venetian combination of speed, precision, and careful logistical planning. Then the disaster that would reshape everything revealed itself. The army that gathered in Venice was a fraction of what had been promised. Thousands of knights and soldiers who had originally pledged to join the expedition had made their own alternative arrangements, sailing from other ports, finding different routes, or simply failing to appear at all. The force that actually assembled in the Lagoon numbered perhaps 1/3 of the original estimate, and the financial consequence was immediate and devastating. The Crusaders counted their collected funds and came up significantly short of the 85,000 marks they owed. They had enough for perhaps half the agreed sum, possibly less. Venice had fulfilled its side of the contract completely and impeccably. The Crusaders had not. The army found itself stranded on the islands of the Lagoon, unable to pay for the fleet that was already built and waiting, unable to continue without Venetian ships, and unable to return home without admitting the complete collapse of the enterprise before it had properly begun. It was precisely in this moment of apparent deadlock, this tense, embarrassing standoff between a creditor with an enormous fleet and a debtor with an enormous army, that Enrico Dandolo demonstrated why he was genuinely extraordinary. A lesser leader might have dissolved the contract, demanded immediate partial payment, or allowed the situation to deteriorate into open conflict between his city and its unwanted guests. Dandolo did none of these things. Instead, with the calm precision of a man who had been thinking several moves ahead from the very beginning, he proposed a solution that appeared to offer the Crusaders a way out of their predicament, while actually redirecting the entire expedition toward objectives that served Venetian interests with surgical exactness. The Crusaders could defer a portion of their debt, he suggested, in exchange for a military service, before sailing to the Holy Land. The army would assist Venice in recapturing the port city of Zara on the Dalmatian coast, a city that had once been under Venetian control, but had broken away and placed itself under the protection of the King of Hungary. Zara sat along critical Adriatic trade routes, and its loss had been a persistent irritation to the Republic's commercial interests in the region. From Venice's perspective, the proposition was almost elegant in its efficiency. The Crusade would pay its debt, not in silver it did not have, but in military service that cost the Republic nothing while recovering a strategically valuable asset. The moral difficulty, however, was severe and immediately recognized by many in the Crusader camp. Zara was a Christian city. Attacking it meant turning a holy war against fellow believers, a violation of everything the Crusade was supposed to represent. Pope Innocent III, when informed of the plan, responded with explicit prohibition and the threat of excommunication for anyone who participated. Many Crusaders refused outright, departing in protest rather than take part in what they considered a betrayal of the crusading ideal. But the majority, trapped by debt and circumstance and the pragmatic calculation that a compromised crusade was better than no crusade at all, reluctantly agreed. Dandolo sealed the arrangement with a gesture of theatrical genius, appearing before the assembled crusaders in St. Mark's Basilica and declaring, at an age when most men had long since made their peace with remaining at home, that he himself would take the cross and sail with the army. The crowd's reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Whatever reservations remained were momentarily swept aside by the spectacle of an ancient, blind doge personally committing himself to the holy enterprise. The fleet set sail. Its first destination was not Jerusalem. It was Zara. And that deviation from the original purpose was only the beginning. Zara fell quickly. The city's inhabitants had hung crosses and Christian banners from their walls in a desperate attempt to remind the approaching army of their shared faith. But the gesture had no effect on an enterprise that had already made its peace with moral compromise. After a brief siege, the gates gave way, the crusaders entered, and the port that Venice had wanted back was back. The Pope, true to his word, issued excommunication against those who had participated in the attack, though he later lifted the censure when it became clear that doing so was the only way to preserve any possibility of the crusade eventually reaching its original destination. The army settled into Zara for the winter, camped in a conquered Christian city, excommunicated by the leader of their own church, and deeply uncertain about what came next. It was in this atmosphere of moral exhaustion and practical confusion that a stranger arrived at the camp, and with him arrived a proposition so extraordinary that it seemed, on first hearing, more like a fever dream than a serious military proposal. The stranger was a young man of perhaps 20 years, well-dressed and clearly of noble origin, carrying himself with the particular combination of urgency and entitlement that belongs to people accustomed to privilege who have recently lost it. His name was Alexios Angelos, and he was the son of a deposed Byzantine emperor. His father, Isaac II, had once ruled Constantinople, but had been overthrown, blinded, and imprisoned by his own brother, who had seized the throne as Alexios III. The younger Alexios had escaped captivity, fled westward, and spent months searching for someone powerful enough and willing enough to help him reclaim what his family had lost. When he heard that a massive crusading army accompanied by the finest fleet in the Mediterranean was wintering on the Dalmatian coast, he recognized his opportunity and moved toward it with the single-minded focus of a man who understood that this was probably his only chance. The offer Alexios brought to the Crusader leadership was structured with a rhetorical sophistication that suggested he or his advisors had thought carefully about exactly what each party in the room most desperately wanted. To the Crusaders, he promised the resolution of their most pressing problem, their debt to Venice, which still hung over the entire enterprise like a creditor's shadow. He would pay it in full. He would go further. He would provide additional funds sufficient to finance the Crusade's journey to Egypt and beyond. And he would contribute a substantial force of Byzantine soldiers to accompany the expedition to the Holy Land. To the Pope, transmitted through the Crusader leadership, he offered something that generations of theological argument and diplomatic effort had failed to produce: the reunification of the Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholic churches under papal authority, healing the great schism that had divided Christendom since 1054. It was, taken as a whole, an offer so comprehensive in its appeal to every audience's desires that it bordered on the suspicious, and several of the more experienced Crusader leaders did indeed find it suspicious, arguing that promises made by a young man with no power base, no treasury, and no army were worth considerably less than the enthusiasm with which they were delivered. But the counter-argument was equally compelling. The crusade was in genuine financial distress. The alternative to accepting Alexios's proposal was either abandoning the entire expedition or proceeding to Egypt without adequate resources, in the hope that something would work out, a hope that military experience gave little reason to sustain. When Enrico Dandolo added his own considerable weight to the argument in favour of accepting, The outcome was effectively decided. The old Doge understood something about Constantinople that the Crusader knights, most of whom had never been east of the Adriatic, could only imagine. He understood its wealth, its strategic position, and the extraordinary commercial advantages that would flow to Venice from having a friendly, deeply indebted emperor on its throne. The fleet turned east, and the Fourth Crusade sailed toward Constantinople. Nothing that any of the Crusaders had seen in their own experience had prepared them for the reality of the city that appeared on the horizon in the summer of 1203. Constantinople was not merely a large city. It was a category of human achievement that had no equivalent in Western Europe at the time. Its land walls, built centuries earlier and never successfully breached by any attacking force, stretched for miles across the peninsula on which the city sat, rising to heights that made the walls of Western European fortifications look almost modest by comparison. Behind those walls lived several 100,000 people, a population that dwarfed every city in France, Germany, England, or Italy. The skyline was dominated by the domes of churches and the towers of palaces, many of them sheathed in materials so reflective that the city seemed to gather light and return it to the sky. The Crusader chronicles that survive from this period describe the army's first sight of Constantinople in terms that make clear how completely it exceeded anything they had anticipated. Knights who had never been moved by the sight of any human construction found themselves standing in silence, struggling to process the scale of what they were looking at. For Dandolo and the Venetians, the reaction was different. They had been here before, had traded in these streets and warehouses, and understood the city's wealth not as an abstract spectacle but as a concrete, calculable reality. The assault that followed was organised with characteristic Venetian efficiency. The fleet approached the sea walls that protected the harbour, and Venetian soldiers used the height advantage of their ships' masts and specially constructed scaling equipment to attack the fortifications directly from the water. The pressure proved sufficient. Emperor Alexios III, demonstrating a talent for self-preservation that outweighed any instinct for heroic resistance, gathered what valuables he could carry and fled the city under cover of darkness, abandoning his throne and his population with equal decisiveness. The old emperor Isaac II was released from his prison cell, and his son Alexios entered Constantinople in triumph as co-emperor. The crusade had achieved its stated objective. A rightful ruler had been restored. The promises made at Zara could now presumably be fulfilled, and the expedition could continue toward its actual destination in the Holy Land. The collapse came with a speed that even the most sceptical observers had not quite anticipated. Alexios IV, as the young prince now styled himself in his new imperial role, discovered almost immediately that the gap between promising imperial resources and actually possessing them was vast and humiliating. The Byzantine treasury was not merely depleted, it was effectively empty. The consequence of years of political instability, military expenditure, and the systematic looting that accompanied every change of regime. To raise the money he had promised, Alexios resorted to measures that enraged the population whose support he desperately needed. He imposed heavy new taxes on people already struggling under the burden of previous fiscal extractions. He ordered the melting down of precious objects from churches and monasteries, gold and silver accumulated over centuries of devotion, now reduced to bullion to pay foreign soldiers. The fury this generated among ordinary Byzantines was immediate and intense. Riots broke out across the city. Fires swept through neighbourhoods as violence between the local population and the Western soldiers stationed outside the walls escalated into something approaching open warfare. In January of 1204, a palace coup ended the experiment definitively. A nobleman named Alexios Doukas, known by the nickname Mortsouflos on account of his heavy eyebrows, seized power with the enthusiastic support of the city's population. Alexios IV was arrested, and shortly afterwards strangled. His father Isaac died within days, either of shock or of illness, or of both combined. The Crusaders' ally was dead. Their promised payment had vanished with him, and the new emperor who faced them across the walls made clear immediately that he intended to honour none of the previous regime's commitments. What followed in April of 1204 was one of the most catastrophic and morally indefensible events in the entire history of medieval Christendom. The Crusader army, now fighting not for the restoration of a friendly emperor, but simply for the payment it was owed, launched a full assault on the city. The Venetian fleet again played the decisive role, approaching the sea walls and using every technique of naval assault that centuries of maritime experience had developed. The walls were breached. The soldiers poured through. For 3 days, Constantinople, the greatest city of the Christian world, the custodian of centuries of accumulated art, scholarship, and sacred treasure, was subjected to looting and destruction of a thoroughness that stunned even those who participated in it. Churches were stripped of their gold and silver. Palaces were ransacked. The Hagia Sophia, the supreme architectural achievement of Byzantine civilization, was entered by soldiers who carried away everything portable and reportedly stabled horses within its sacred nave. For Venice, the material outcome was extraordinary control of key ports and islands across the eastern Mediterranean, trading privileges of unprecedented scope, and among the physical treasures brought back to the Lagoon, 4 magnificent bronze horses that would stand above the entrance of St. Mark's Basilica for centuries, silent witnesses to the most profitable and most troubling episode in the Republic's long history. In the immediate aftermath of the sack of Constantinople, the victors faced a question that military success almost always eventually produces, a question that is in many ways harder than the military problem that preceded it. They had destroyed one of the most powerful states in the medieval world. Now they had to decide what to do with the wreckage. For the French and Flemish Crusader nobles who had provided the bulk of the land army, the answer drew naturally on the only political model they knew. They began dividing the former Byzantine territories into feudal lordships, distributing lands, titles, and populations among the knights and nobles who had participated in the conquest. A Latin empire was proclaimed in Constantinople, with a Flemish count named Baldwin elected as its first emperor. Across Greece and the Aegean, smaller kingdoms and principalities took shape as Western European aristocrats installed themselves as lords over populations whose language, religion, and customs they neither understood nor particularly wished to understand. Castles were claimed, crowns were distributed, and the elaborate machinery of Western feudalism was transplanted onto soil that had never been organized along those lines and would, as subsequent decades demonstrated, prove deeply resistant to the imposition. The Venetians watched this process with the detached interest of people who had already identified what they wanted and had no intention of wasting time on anything else. What the Crusader nobles were building land empires requiring armies, administrators, and the constant, expensive management of agricultural populations held essentially no appeal for a republic whose entire civilization had been organized around a different principle entirely. Venice did not want to govern large territories. It wanted to control the spaces between them. The distinction sounds subtle, but its practical implications were enormous. What the Venetian leadership constructed in the years following 1204 was something without real precedent in the medieval world. A maritime empire organized not around territorial possession, but around positional control. They called it, with characteristic Venetian directness, the Stato di Mare, the state of the sea. Rather than claiming broad swaths of inland territory, Venice selected with careful strategic intelligence the specific locations that controlled the flow of maritime trade across the eastern Mediterranean, ports where ships needed to stop for water and provisions, islands that commanded the approaches to important sea lanes, coastal fortresses that could shelter friendly fleets and deny passage to hostile ones. Each acquisition was evaluated not by the size of its population or the fertility of its agricultural land, but by its position on the maritime map, its usefulness as a node in the network that Venice was systematically assembling across the entire eastern Mediterranean basin. The result, built up over the decades following the Fourth Crusade and supplemented by additional acquisitions through purchase. inheritance, and military action across the following centuries was a chain of outposts that stretched from the northern Adriatic all the way to the eastern shores of the Mediterranean. Looked at on a map, it resembled nothing so much as a carefully planned series of stepping stones, each one positioned to make the next reachable. Each one contributing to a system whose value was not in any individual component, but in the connectivity of the whole. A Venetian merchant ship leaving the lagoon could travel the entire length of the Mediterranean, from the Adriatic to the Levant, touching at Venetian-controlled harbours at every stage of the journey, resupplying, repairing damage, and finding protection under the Lion of St. Mark at each stop along the way. The crown jewel of this maritime empire was the large and strategically magnificent island of Crete, which Venice acquired as part of its share of the post-Crusade distribution and renamed the Kingdom of Candia. Crete's value was almost impossible to overstate from a naval and commercial perspective. The island sat near the centre of the eastern Mediterranean, positioned at the crossroads of the sea lanes connecting the Adriatic to the Levant, to Egypt, and to the Black Sea routes through which grain from the Ukrainian steppes flowed westward to feed populations across the Mediterranean world. A fleet based in Crete could respond to threats anywhere in the eastern Mediterranean within a matter of days. A merchant convoy stopping in Crete could resupply, take on fresh water, carry out repairs, and receive current intelligence about conditions further along the route. For Venice, Candia was not merely a territorial possession, it was a strategic hub of the First Order, the anchor of the entire Stato da Mar, whose loss in later centuries would prove to be a blow from which the Republic's Eastern Empire never fully recovered. Beyond Crete, the chain of Venetian possessions included numerous islands in the Aegean Sea, each smaller than Crete, but each contributing to the system's overall resilience. Corfu guarded the entrance to the Adriatic itself. Modon and Coron, on the southwestern tip of the Peloponnese, referred to by Venetian sailors with affectionate commercial pride as the two eyes of the Republic, provided essential stopping points for ships traversing the western Mediterranean. Approaches to the east, Negroponte, the island of Euboea lying just off the coast of mainland Greece, offered a base from which Venetian interests in the Aegean could be monitored and defended. Each of these places was connected to the others and to Venice itself through the regular sailing schedules of the merchant convoys that the Republic organized and dispatched with the methodical efficiency that characterized everything it did at its best. Governance of these overseas territories reflected the same pragmatic intelligence that had shaped their acquisition. Venice had no interest in imposing uniformity on populations whose cooperation was more valuable than their conversion to Venetian customs. On Crete and the other islands, Greek populations continued to speak their own language, practiced the Eastern Orthodox Christianity that had defined their religious identity for centuries, and organized their local social lives according to traditions that predated Venetian arrival by many generations. Venetian administrators drawn from the noble families of the Republic and appointed for fixed terms of service before returning to Venice, a practice that prevented the development of the kind of local dynastic interests that might have competed with the Republic's authority, were primarily concerned with maintaining the conditions under which trade could flourish. They collected taxes, administered justice according to a legal framework imported from Venice, maintained the fortifications that protected the harbours, and ensured that the political stability necessary for commercial activity was preserved. Beyond these essentially commercial priorities, they governed lightly. This relative restraint was not idealism, it was calculation. A restive, resentful population required more soldiers and more administrative energy to manage than a population that was, if not enthusiastic about Venetian rule, at least not actively hostile to it. The resources the Republic saved by governing its overseas territories with a comparatively light hand could be redirected toward the fleet and the commercial infrastructure that were the actual sources of its power. By the middle of the 13th century, the Stato da Mar had matured into one of the most sophisticated and efficient commercial empires the world had yet seen. Goods from Asia, spices from the Moluccas, silks from China, cotton from Egypt, sugar from Cyprus, Precious stones from India travelled along established routes through Middle Eastern intermediaries to the ports of the Levant, where Venetian merchants collected them and loaded them onto ships that moved them westward through the chain of Venetian-controlled harbours to the markets of Europe. The profits generated by this system were enormous, flowing back to Venice in quantities that funded the construction of palaces, the patronage of artists, the maintenance of the arsenal, and the salaries of the diplomats and naval commanders who kept the whole enterprise functioning. Venice had transformed the Eastern Mediterranean into something close to a managed commercial environment, and it sat at the centre of that environment with the quiet confidence of an institution that had organised things exactly as it intended and saw no particular reason to change them. There is a particular kind of restlessness that belongs to cities built on trade, a constant, low-level dissatisfaction with the boundaries of the known, an instinctive suspicion that somewhere beyond the edge of the current map there are markets not yet reached, goods not yet priced, opportunities not yet seized by a competitor who got there first. Venice had this quality in abundance, and it expressed itself not only in the systematic expansion of the Stato da Mar, but in the individual ambitions of merchant families who were always looking further, always calculating whether the next horizon might be more profitable than the one currently in view. The Mediterranean, vast as it was also, by the 13th century, increasingly familiar, its ports catalogued, its sea lanes charted, its commercial relationships established and competed over by multiple powers simultaneously. The really extraordinary profits, the kind that came from being the first rather than merely the best among many, lay further east, in the lands that connected the Mediterranean world to the civilizations of India, Central Asia, and China. Most Venetian merchants reached these distant sources of luxury goods only indirectly, purchasing from Arab or Persian intermediaries who controlled the overland and oceanic routes from Asia to the Mediterranean and extracted substantial profits at every stage of the transaction. The question that occasionally occurred to the most ambitious among them was whether it might be possible to bypass those intermediaries entirely to travel the routes themselves, reach the sources directly, and bring back not merely goods, but the kind of first-hand knowledge that would give a merchant house a generational advantage over every competitor who had never made the journey. In 1271, a 17-year-old Venetian named Marco Polo set out to answer that question, and in doing so became perhaps the most famous traveller in the history of the world. Marco did not depart alone, and the journey he undertook was not entirely without precedent, even within his own family. His father Niccolo and his uncle Maffeo had already made one extraordinary journey eastward, travelling through Persia and Central Asia as far as the court of Kublai Khan, the Mongol ruler whose empire stretched across the greater part of the Asian continent, and had returned to Venice in 1269 with messages from the Khan and a commission to bring back learned men and sacred oil from Jerusalem. When they set out again 2 years later, they brought the teenage Marco with them, a decision whose consequences none of the three could possibly have anticipated at the time of departure. The route they followed was the ancient network of overland trade paths known collectively as the Silk Road, a term that somewhat romanticizes what was in practice a grueling series of difficult passages through some of the most inhospitable terrain on earth. From the port of Acre on the Mediterranean coast, they travelled northward through Anatolia and then eastward into Persia, crossing landscapes that alternated between baking desert heat and the bitter cold of high mountain passes. They crossed the great salt deserts of eastern Persia, regions where water sources were separated by distances that could kill a caravan caught without adequate supplies. They climbed into the Pamir Mountains, the roof of the world, as travellers had called them for centuries, with some justification where the altitude made breathing difficult and the cold at night was severe enough to be genuinely dangerous. Through all of this, the young Marco was observing, absorbing, and apparently storing in his remarkable memory a quantity and quality of detail about the lands through which he passed that would later fill one of the most widely read books in European history. After more than 3 years of travel, 3 years during which the world that Marco had known in Venice must have receded to something barely imaginable, the Polo family finally arrived at the court of Kublai Khan, at his magnificent capital. What they found there was a civilization of a scale and sophistication that had no parallel in anything Marco had previously experienced. Kublai Khan ruled over an empire that encompassed most of what we now call China, along with vast territories stretching westward into Central Asia, an administrative and military achievement of genuinely staggering dimensions. Holding together populations, speaking dozens of different languages across distances that made the entire Mediterranean world seem compact by comparison. The Khan's capital was a city of extraordinary size and organization, its streets laid out with geometric precision, its markets overflowing with goods from every corner of the empire, its population fed and supplied by a canal and road network of an efficiency that would have astonished even the most experienced Venetian administrator. Marco encountered things in China that simply had no equivalent in the European experience of the 13th century. Paper money currency that derived its value not from the metal it was made of, but from the authority of the state that issued it, was in widespread use throughout the empire. Accepted without question in transactions of every scale, a postal relay system of remarkable speed and reliability connected the furthest corners of the empire to the imperial centre, using a network of way stations stocked with fresh horses so that messages and imperial decrees could travel enormous distances in days rather than weeks. Coal was burned for fuel, a substance Marco had apparently never encountered before, describing it with the careful curiosity of a man documenting something genuinely new to his experience. The sheer number and population of the cities he visited overwhelmed his capacity for comparison. City after city exceeding in size and wealth anything that Western Europe could then produce. Kublai Khan was fascinated by his Venetian visitors, particularly by the young Marco, whose intelligence, linguistic aptitude, and powers of observation impressed the emperor sufficiently that he assigned the young man to his service, sending him on administrative missions to various parts of the empire and listening attentively to the detailed reports he brought back. For nearly 17 years, Marco Polo lived within the world of the Mongol Empire, travelling distances that would have been extraordinary even for a professional explorer, accumulating experiences and observations that no Western European had previously gathered in such depth or recorded in such detail. The return journey, when it finally came in 1291, was made by sea rather than overland, a route through the South China Sea, around the Indian subcontinent, and across the Arabian Sea and Persian Gulf that took approximately 3 years and introduced Marco to yet another set of civilizations and commercial environments that Europe had barely begun to comprehend. When the 3 Polos finally arrived back in Venice in 1295, 24 years had elapsed since their departure. The city they returned to had continued its own development in their absence, but it was still recognizably the Venice they had left: the same lagoon, the same basilica, the same commercial energy directed through the same channels. The travellers, by contrast, had been so thoroughly transformed by their experience that contemporary accounts describe them as barely recognizable to people who had known them before departure, wearing clothing of Mongol style and speaking Italian with the hesitations of men who had spent decades thinking in other languages. The legend that has attached itself to their return, that they cut open the seams of their travel-worn garments at a celebratory feast to reveal precious stones hidden within, rubies and sapphires and diamonds cascading onto the table before astonished guests, may be embellished in its details. But it captures something true about the nature of what they had brought back. The physical wealth was real. The knowledge was more valuable still. The story of how that knowledge reached the wider world is itself almost as remarkable as the journey that produced it. Several years after his return, Marco Polo was captured during a naval engagement with Genoa and imprisoned. In his cell he encountered a writer from Pisa named Rustichello, who recognized in his fellow prisoners' stories material of extraordinary interest and helped Marco organize and dictate them into the book that became known across Europe as the Travels of Marco Polo, dismissed by skeptics as fantasy. as a million lies, yet studied with intense attention by navigators and geographers who sensed, correctly, that it described a real world of almost unimaginable commercial possibility waiting beyond the eastern horizon. Among those who read it carefully, annotating its pages and drawing on its descriptions in the planning of a westward voyage that he believed would reach the Asian markets Marco had described, was a Genoese navigator named Christopher Columbus. The journey of a Venetian merchant's son through the court of a Mongol emperor had helped set in motion the exploration of a hemisphere that neither Marco nor Columbus nor anyone else in the medieval world had suspected existed. Rivalry between great powers rarely announces itself clearly at the beginning. It accumulates gradually, through a series of small frictions and competitive encounters that individually seem manageable but collectively build towards something far more serious. The rivalry between Venice and Genoa had been accumulating in exactly this way for well over a century before it finally reached its most dangerous expression in the late 14th century. Both cities were merchant republics governed by commercially minded elites whose fortunes depended on maritime trade. Both had built powerful fleets. Both had established networks of overseas trading posts and colonial outposts across the Mediterranean and beyond. Both understood, with the clarity that comes from direct commercial competition, that the Mediterranean was not large enough to accommodate two dominant maritime powers operating without limit, that every market captured by one city was a market partially or wholly denied to the other, and that the long-term prosperity of each depended in some fundamental way on the diminishment of the other. The competition expressed itself across multiple theatres simultaneously. In the markets of Constantinople, Venetian and Genoese merchants competed for the same customers, the same warehouse space, and the same favourable positions along the waterfront. In the ports of the Black Sea, where grain from the Ukrainian steppes and furs and slaves from the northern regions flowed toward Mediterranean markets, their factors and agents worked constantly to undercut each other's prices and secure exclusive arrangements with local suppliers. In the eastern Mediterranean ports where the spice trade converged before distribution westward, the presence of both communities created a permanent low-level commercial warfare that occasionally flared into physical violence between competing crews and merchants. The naval battles that punctuated this long rivalry were brutal encounters between forces of roughly comparable capability, neither side able to achieve the kind of decisive superiority that would end the competition permanently. For decades, the struggle continued without resolution, each republic absorbing its losses, rebuilding its fleets, and returning to the contest with undiminished determination. The War of Chioggia, which erupted in 1378, was different from the previous rounds of Venetian-Genoese conflict. In one critical respect, it was not a war that Venice could afford to lose without consequences that went far beyond the commercial. Previous conflicts had damaged trade, disrupted shipping routes, and imposed significant financial costs on both sides. But neither republic had ever faced the possibility of actual annihilation. The War of Chioggia brought Venice closer to that possibility than it had ever been before, or would ever be again. The Genoese leadership, in planning the campaign, had identified something that previous conflicts had left, unexploited, a geographic vulnerability in Venice's position that, properly targeted, could strangle the city without requiring a direct assault on its formidable lagoon defences. Venice depended on the sea lanes of the northern Adriatic for the food supplies that kept its population alive. The city produced almost nothing agriculturally on its own. Every loaf of bread, every sack of grain, every barrel of salted fish that fed the lagoon's population arrived by water from the mainland or from more distant sources. Cut those supply lines effectively, and Venice would face not military defeat in any conventional sense, but something potentially more devastating: the slow, inexorable pressure of hunger applied to a dense urban population with nowhere to retreat and no alternative source of sustenance. The Genoese strategy aimed at exactly this vulnerability. In alliance with the King of Hungary and the Lord of Padua, Francesco de Carrara, both of whom had their own grievances against Venice, and were willing to coordinate land-based pressure with Genoese naval action. They assembled a force capable of operating on multiple fronts simultaneously. The campaign that followed moved with a speed that caught Venice partially off guard. In the summer of 1379, the Genoese fleet achieved something that no enemy had managed in the entire history of the Republic. It captured Chioggia, a substantial town sitting at the southern edge of the Venetian Lagoon, barely 15 miles from Venice itself. The psychological impact of this achievement on the population of Venice was enormous and immediate. Chioggia was not a distant outpost on a remote island or a trading post in some far corner of the Mediterranean. It was practically a neighbour, close enough that on clear days its towers were visible from the southern reaches of the lagoon. Its fall meant that the enemy was not merely threatening Venice from a comfortable distance, it was positioned at the Republic's doorstep, controlling the southern approaches to the lagoon and capable of interdicting the supply routes that kept the city alive. With Chioggia in Genoese hands and allied forces pressing on the mainland approaches, Venice found itself in a situation of genuine and serious danger. The mood within the city shifted from confidence to something closer to controlled panic. The Great Council met in emergency session. Resources were counted and found wanting. The treasury was strained by the costs of a war that had already consumed enormous quantities of silver. The fleet available for immediate deployment was insufficient to challenge the Genoese position directly. Food stocks were being carefully monitored by officials who understood exactly how long they would last against a prolonged blockade. For the first and essentially only time in its history, Venice faced the real possibility that the Republic might not survive. What happened next revealed something essential about the Venetian character, that the city's long prosperity had perhaps obscured the same qualities that had allowed desperate refugees to build a civilization on mud could, when sufficiently provoked, produce a response of extraordinary collective determination. The Senate made a series of decisions that demonstrated both the flexibility of Venetian institutions and the depth of the population's commitment to the Republic's survival. New taxes were levied, and largely paid without the resistance that might have been expected from a population already under pressure. Citizens donated personal wealth jewellery, silver plate, family savings to the war fund, with a spontaneity that surprised even the officials who had called for the contributions. Noble families that had previously shown no military inclination equipped and manned galleys at their own expense. But perhaps the most revealing decision concerned a man named Vetta Pisani. Pisani was a Venetian admiral of genuine ability and enormous popular affection, a commander whose sailors trusted him and whose straightforward, courageous style of leadership had made him beloved by the ordinary people of the city in a way that more aristocratic commanders rarely achieved. He had suffered a significant naval defeat earlier in the war and had been imprisoned by the Senate, which held him responsible for the losses. As the crisis deepened and options narrowed, voices began rising from the population demanding his release. The Senate, demonstrating the kind of pragmatic flexibility that distinguished Venetian governance at its best, set aside the verdict against him and released Pisani to take command of the Republic's forces. The crowds that greeted him in the streets made clear that his restoration had done something important beyond the purely military. It had given the population a focal point for the determination that was building across the city. Under Pisani's command, and with the additional forces provided by a relief fleet that arrived under Carlo Zeno after a long campaign in distant waters, Venice executed a strategic reversal of remarkable ingenuity. Rather than attempting to storm the Genoese position at Chioggia directly, an assault that would have been costly and uncertain in its outcome, the Venetians systematically blocked the channels through which the Genoese fleet had entered. Lagoon, using sunken ships and constructed barriers to seal the enemy inside the very position they had captured. The hunters became the hunted. The Genoese force that had arrived to strangle Venice found itself trapped, its supplies dwindling, its communication with the outside world severed, its strategic position transforming from one of strength to one of steadily increasing desperation. By June of 1380, the Genoese commander at Chioggia surrendered. The war ended shortly afterward with the Peace of Turin, a settlement that left Venice's fundamental position intact and demonstrated to the Mediterranean world something that the Republic's enemies had perhaps underestimated: that Venice, under genuine existential pressure, did not fracture or capitulate, but instead found within itself reserves of collective resolve that made it more dangerous cornered than it had ever been at ease. There are moments in history when a single event reshapes the world so completely that everything that came before it suddenly looks like a different era, not merely an earlier time, but an entirely different kind of time, operating according to rules that the new reality has permanently invalidated for Venice, and for the entire Eastern Mediterranean world that the Republic had spent centuries organizing to its advantage. That moment arrived on the 29th of May, 1453, when Ottoman forces under the command of Sultan Mehmed II breached the walls of Constantinople after a siege of nearly 2 months and ended the Byzantine Empire that had endured, in various forms and with varying degrees of strength, for over 1,000 years. The fall of Constantinople was not entirely a surprise. The Byzantine Empire had been contracting for decades, losing territory to Ottoman pressure with the slow inevitability of a tide gone out, and the city itself had been in a condition of relative poverty and demographic decline for well over a century since the catastrophic damage inflicted by the Fourth Crusade. But knowing intellectually that something is coming and experiencing its actual arrival are entirely different things. And when the news reached Venice by ship in late June of 1453, the reaction combined genuine shock with the rapid, almost reflexive calculation of a mercantile civilization immediately assessing the practical consequences. The city that had served as the eastern anchor of Venetian commercial operations for nearly 4 centuries, the city whose markets had made Venetian fortunes across generations, whose golden horn had sheltered Venetian ships, whose population had consumed Venetian goods and produced the luxury commodities that Venetian merchants carried westward, was now in the hands of a power whose relationship with Venice would need to be negotiated from an entirely different starting position than anything the Republic had previously experienced. The complexity of Venice's relationship with the Ottoman Empire across the following century and a half defied any simple characterization as either alliance or enmity. The Republic's fundamental commitment was always to trade rather than to crusade, and this commercial pragmatism led it to pursue policies toward the Ottomans that other Christian powers sometimes found shocking in their flexibility. Venice negotiated trading agreements with Mehmed II within a few years of the fall of Constantinople, accepting conditions that would have been unthinkable in dealings with the Byzantine emperors, but which preserved Venetian access to the eastern Mediterranean markets that remained essential to the Republic's prosperity. Venetian merchants continued to operate in Ottoman-controlled ports, paying duties and operating under Ottoman commercial law, making the practical calculations of businessmen rather than the ideological calculations of crusaders. This pragmatism had real costs in terms of the Republic's reputation among other Christian powers, who periodically accused Venice of placing profit above faith, an accusation that the Venetians largely absorbed without visible distress, understanding that a city which could not trade was a city that could not survive, regardless of how admirably it had positioned itself on the correct side of a religious confrontation. But the pragmatism also had limits. The Ottoman expansion across the eastern Mediterranean was not merely a commercial inconvenience that could be managed through skillful diplomacy. It was a direct military threat to the Stato de Mar, the chain of ports and islands that formed the physical infrastructure of Venetian power in the east. As Ottoman naval capability grew across the second half of the 15th century, matching and eventually exceeding Venetian strength in the eastern Mediterranean, the Republic found itself engaged in a series of wars that were expensive, exhausting, and ultimately losing propositions against an adversary whose resources in men and material dwarfed anything Venice could mobilize. The losses accumulated with a painful, grinding regularity across the late 15th and 16th centuries. Negroponte, the island of Euboea that had been one of the key nodes in the Venetian Aegean network, fell to Ottoman forces in 1470, after a siege during which a Venetian relief fleet arrived too late and too cautiously to prevent the island's surrender. The loss of Negroponte sent shockwaves through Venice not merely because of the island's strategic value, which was considerable, but because it demonstrated that the Ottoman navy had matured into a force capable of conducting sustained amphibious operations against well-fortified Venetian positions. The two eyes of the Republic, the vital ports of Modon and Coron on the southwestern Peloponnese that Venetian sailors had relied upon for generations as essential waypoints on the route between the Adriatic and the eastern Mediterranean, were lost in 1500. Falling to an Ottoman advance that swept through the remaining Venetian positions in mainland Greece with a thoroughness that left the Republic's Aegean network seriously degraded. Cyprus, the large and wealthy island that had become one of Venice's most valuable eastern possessions, providing sugar, cotton, and a strategically crucial position at the northeastern corner of the Mediterranean, was lost after a brutal Ottoman campaign in 1570 and 1571 that included the infamous siege of Famagusta, a defence conducted with extraordinary courage by a Venetian garrison under Marcantonio Bragadin that held out for nearly a year before being forced to surrender, after which Bragadin was subjected to a public execution of such calculated cruelty that its details circulated across Europe as a testament to the savagery of the confrontation. Against this backdrop of territorial attrition, the Battle of Lepanto in October of 1571 offered a moment of dramatic reversal that briefly illuminated the darkness of the preceding decades with something approaching genuine hope. A combined Christian fleet assembled under the auspices of the Holy League Venice, Spain, and the papacy contributing the bulk of the force met the Ottoman fleet in the Gulf of Patras off the western coast of Greece and inflicted upon it the most comprehensive naval defeat in Ottoman history. Hundreds of Ottoman galleys were sunk or captured. Tens of thousands of men were killed or liberated from the oars where they had served as slaves. The myth of Ottoman naval invincibility, which had accumulated steadily since the fall of Constantinople, was shattered in a single afternoon of extraordinarily violent and chaotic fighting. Venice celebrated with a fervour that reflected genuine relief as much as pride the sense that a pressure that had been building for decades had finally, at least momentarily, been released. Yet Lepanto, for all its immediate drama and long-term symbolic importance, did not actually reverse the strategic position that Venice occupied in the eastern Mediterranean. Cyprus was not recovered. The Ottoman Empire rebuilt its naval forces with a speed that demonstrated the enormous depth of its resources, launching new galleys within months of the battle in quantities that the Holy League partners could not match. The fundamental asymmetry between Ottoman capacity and Venetian capacity in the eastern Mediterranean was not altered by a single battle, however spectacular, and while Venice was struggling to manage the Ottoman challenge in the east, a far more structurally significant transformation was quietly reshaping the entire commercial world on which the Republic's prosperity depended. In 1498, the Portuguese navigator Vasco da Gama completed the first European sea voyage around the southern tip of Africa and across the Indian Ocean to the port of Calicut on the southwestern coast of India. The route he had pioneered bypassed the entire Mediterranean trading system, the Arab and Persian intermediaries, the Levantine ports, the Venetian distribution network, and connected the spice-producing regions of Asia directly to Atlantic Europe by a maritime route that neither Venice nor any other Mediterranean power controlled or could easily contest. The implications for Venice were profound and, in the long run, irreversible. The spice trade that had been one of the foundational sources of Venetian commercial dominance, the trade that had made the Republic's fortune across 3 centuries, that had funded its palaces and its fleet and its diplomatic network, began slowly but unmistakably to shift toward the Atlantic routes controlled by Portugal and subsequently by the Netherlands and England. Venice did not collapse overnight. The Mediterranean remained commercially active, and Venetian merchants adapted with characteristic ingenuity, finding new commodities and new markets to replace those being siphoned away by the Atlantic powers. But the structural position that had made Venice uniquely indispensable sitting at the western end of the most important trade routes in the world was being permanently undermined by a geographical revolution that no amount of diplomatic skill or naval power could reverse. Decline, when it comes to a great civilization, rarely arrives as a sudden collapse. It comes instead as a long, slow adjustment, a gradual recalibration of ambitions, a quiet retreat from positions that had once seemed permanent, a series of individual decisions, each of which makes perfect sense in isolation, but which together trace the outline of a trajectory moving steadily downward. Venice, in the 16th, 17th, and early 18th centuries, was a civilization in exactly this kind of decline, not broken, not humiliated, not reduced to irrelevance, but no longer the dominant force it had once been, no longer the indispensable node through which the wealth of the Eastern world flowed into European markets. The Republic understood its situation with the clear-eyed realism that had always been one of its defining characteristics. It could not reverse the shift of global trade toward the Atlantic. It could not rebuild an Eastern empire that the Ottomans had systematically dismantled over the course of a century. It could not compete militarily or commercially with the emerging Atlantic powers Portugal, Spain, the Netherlands, England, whose access to the resources of the Americas and the direct sea routes to Asia gave them structural advantages that Venice, locked into the Mediterranean, simply could not match. What Venice could do, and what it proceeded to do with considerable skill and evident enjoyment, was reinvent itself. The city that had once been the most important commercial hub in the Western world became, across the later centuries of the Republic's existence, something different but in its own way equally remarkable, a centre of artistic production, intellectual life, sophisticated pleasure, and cultural prestige, whose influence extended far beyond what its diminished commercial and military power might have suggested. The artistic legacy that Venice produced across the 16th and 17th centuries was extraordinary by any standard of measurement. The city had always been a place where beauty was taken seriously: the mosaics of St. Mark's Basilica, the ceremonial splendour of the Bucintoro, the architectural elegance of the palaces lining the Grand Canal, all testified to a civilization that understood the political and social value of magnificence and invested in it accordingly. But the Renaissance unleashed something in Venetian artistic life that went beyond civic decoration and entered the realm of genuine creative revolution. Titian, who worked in Venice across a career of almost unimaginable length and productivity, transformed the possibilities of oil painting with a handling of colour and light that influenced every significant European painter who came after him. His reds became legendary. His treatment of human flesh so convincing that later artists studied his techniques with something approaching reverence. Tintoretto brought to the enormous canvases with which he filled Venetian churches and scuole a drama and energy that seemed to compress entire narratives into single overwhelming images, the figures twisting and reaching across compositions of monumental scale with an intensity that could make even a familiar biblical story feel immediate and urgent. Paolo Veronese covered walls and ceilings with celebrations of Venetian life rendered in colours of almost hallucinatory richness. His banquets and allegorical scenes, populated with figures dressed in the silks and brocades of contemporary Venice, blurring the boundary between sacred subject matter and the glorification of the city that commissioned the work. Together, these painters and the dozens of lesser but still remarkable talents who worked alongside and after them created a visual culture of such distinctive character that Venetian painting became a recognized category in the history of art, identifiable at a glance by its handling of light on water, its love of rich colour, and its particular quality of sensuous, unapologetic enjoyment of the visible world. Music added another dimension to this cultural flowering. Antonio Vivaldi, born in Venice in 1678 and working there across the first half of the 18th century, composed with a fluency and inventiveness that made him one of the most performed composers in Europe during his lifetime. After a long period of relative neglect, one of the most beloved in the centuries that followed, his concertos, hundreds of them, organised into collections with evocative titles that reflected the Venetian love of theatrical presentation, established structural patterns that shaped the development of instrumental music across the entire continent. The Four Seasons, his most famous collection, translated the sensory experience of the natural world into music of such vividness and immediacy that it communicated across every language barrier and every difference of musical training, speaking directly to listeners who might have been unable to articulate why it moved them, but who responded to it instinctively and completely. Venice was also, in these later centuries, the home of one of Europe's most important publishing industries. Its presses, producing books in quantities and varieties that made the city a centre of the intellectual life of the continent. The Carnival of Venice, which had developed across the medieval period as an annual festival of licensed excess before the austerity of Lent, grew in the later centuries of the Republic into something more elaborate and more commercially sophisticated, a months-long festival that attracted visitors from across Europe, offering the pleasures of masked anonymity, theatrical performance, music, gambling, and a general suspension of the social hierarchies that governed ordinary life, all packaged and presented with the theatrical genius that Venice had been developing since the days of the Bucintoro and the Marriage to the Sea. The city had always understood that spectacle was a form of power, and in these later centuries, when military and commercial power had diminished, the power of spectacle became more important than ever. Venice reinvented itself as Europe's playground, and it performed that role with the same systematic professionalism it had once brought to the management of the spice trade. The end, when it finally came, arrived not through military defeat in any conventional sense, but through an encounter with a force that the Republic's elaborate political machinery had never been designed to resist the revolutionary energy of Napoleonic France, which recognized in the ancient institutions of the Venetian Republic not a fellow state to be negotiated with, but an anachronism to be swept aside. In May of 1797, Napoleon Bonaparte delivered an ultimatum to the Venetian Senate that amounted to a demand for surrender, and the Senate, aged, exhausted, and confronting a military reality it had no capacity to alter, voted to accept his terms and dissolve the republic that had endured, in unbroken institutional continuity, for over 1,000 years. The last Doge, Ludovico Manin, reportedly removed his ducal cap as the vote was announced and handed it to his attendant with the words that he would not be needing it again. It was, in its quiet way, one of the most dignified endings in the history of any political institution. No dramatic last stand, no heroic final gesture, just a tired old man handing over a symbol of authority that circumstances had rendered ceremonial long before the formal act of abdication made it official. What Venice left behind was a legacy of almost incomprehensible richness and variety. It had demonstrated that a republican form of government, carefully designed to prevent the concentration of power in any single pair of hands, could endure across centuries that destroyed kingdoms, empire, and dynasties. It had shown that a city without natural resources or agricultural land could, through the application of intelligence and organization and commercial skill, build an empire more durable and more profitable than many built by conquest. It had produced art and music and architecture that continued to move people across the centuries, that drew visitors from every corner of the world to stand before its canals and its basilicas and experience something that resisted easy description, the accumulated presence of a civilization that had believed, with every transaction and every act of construction and every ceremony on the water, that beauty and practicality were not opposites but partners, each incomplete without the other. Venice began as a refuge in the mud and ended as a legend in marble and gold. Between those 2 points lay 1,000 years of human ingenuity, ambition, courage, and beauty that the world has never quite managed to forget, and almost certainly never will.